Welcome to the Quickly Explained series of Identity and Access Management 101 with Raw Technologies. In this series, our goal is to take foundational concepts of identity and access management and explain them effectively in a short amount of time. This series is geared towards beginners in the identity and access management space, decision makers looking to build out an IAM program who need a quick start, or anyone with a general interest in identity, security, or cybersecurity as a whole. So for our maiden voyage, we've decided to start simple by covering the concept of authentication. Simply explained, authentication is the process of determining whether someone or something is in fact who or what they say they are. This happens pretty much everywhere in daily life. It happens in places that you wouldn't really think about too, and we're going to show you a few examples of that. There's something called partial authentication, and this is where only a certain portion of your data needs to be validated to provide you access to a certain service. So a prime example of that is when you go to the bar. They need your ID card, but they don't need to know your first name. They don't need to know your last name. They don't need to know any of the other details on your driver's license except for your age. Similarly, when you go pick up a pack of smokes at your local store, typically they only need to know your age. But they do take your license to just make sure that you are who you say you are and that you are of an age where you can purchase cigarettes or you can purchase alcohol. Now, there's full authentication, which is basically full-blown in terms of all of your data is being run. A good example of this in real life is when you get pulled over by the police. So there's multiple factors involved. Whenever a cop pulls you over, an officer runs a check first of your license plate, right? So the first thing they do is they check to see if it's a valid plate. They check if the plate and the vehicle it is on match the registration information that they have on file when they ran the plate. They check the information for the owner of the plate and the corresponding vehicle as well. And they check to see if the car is properly registered, valid, and it's not stolen, and nothing comes back on it. So let's talk about what authentication is in the context of IT, right? So the most common way people authenticate in IT environments is typically just credential-based authentication. You're authenticating a username and a password. On top of that, sometimes you put MFA, which is multi-factor authentication, which allows you to add a third factor or fourth factor or how many ever you want on top of username and password. So typically this is when you're logging into something like your bank account, and you put in your username, you put in your password, but then it texts a code to your phone basically saying enter this code on the UI provided and you'll be good to go. That's a third factor qualification that allows you to determine whether or not the person who is signing in to the account is the owner of the account based on ownership of a device that allows them to receive a third factor code. So let's talk a little bit about what this looks like in an IT environment from an architectural standpoint, what happens behind the scenes. This is a 30,000 foot view. This isn't very in-depth, but basically the first thing that you see is a user will navigate to a website, and from there they click on the login button on that site, and that is going to redirect them to the identity provider. This is typically in today's IT environments. This is what happens is where that identity provider will then spin up an authentication window, like right here, and you'll be prompted to enter your email and password. From that point, the provider will actually do a check against their credential DB if that user is already registered to make sure that that is an existing user. From there, it takes that combination, says, okay, is the password that this person entered match what we have in our DB? If the answer is yes, the DB returns a response that everything is good. And then from there, the identity provider sends a response back to the service with an ID token, pretty much, that provides context of the user from the credential DB. And from there, you'll see that the user gets signed in to the service and they're redirected to the application page. So this is typical in your service environments, or in something that you're logging into at work, or in even if you're logging into a loyalty rewards application to buy some coffee. This is a typical process that occurs. Authentication is also a huge component of customer identity and access management, or CIAM for short. CIAM is the management, administration, and full suite identity lifecycle of customers. CIAM solutions typically include user login to customer-facing applications that allow for non-corporate users to access applications and to patronize your business by providing credential pairs to log in against a customer-facing credential database that is exposed via the endpoint the customer is trying to access. Traditionally, there are three main factors to authentication, which these are just data points that can be used to authenticate users, devices, or anything else that requests access to a system. Your first type of factor is a knowledge factor. It's going to be something that is known, like a username and password. Your second factor is going to be an ownership factor, something that is owned, like a YubiKey, which, if you didn't know, is a hardware device that you can use to sign into computers so you don't have to use a password, or you can use it as another factor to a password. And then there's inherent factors. These are things that are inherent to your state of being. These are like biometrics, so your fingerprint, your voice, stuff like that, that are inherent to you and unique to you. There are other conditional authentication factors that come into play when looking at how authentication and conditional access, when paired with strong multi-factor, can secure access to an extremely fine-grained level. But we will cover that in our next few videos about multi-factor authentication, and with further down the series as well about conditional access.